Kyiv in 3 days. That was the plan. When Russian tanks rolled across the border on February 24, 2022, the Kremlin's strategists had built their entire calculation on one pivotal assumption. Only 10% of Ukrainians would resist, while 90% would greet Russian troops with bread and salt. Propagandist Margarita Simonyan dismissed Ukraine with a casual wave of her hand. A couple of days and that's it. Her colleague Zakhar Prilipin went even further, declaring that all of Ukraine's independence and sovereignty would be worth exactly zero within 7 minutes of Russian troops appearing on the line of contact. 4 years later, the zero does not belong to Ukraine. There are moments in war when something happens that completely changes the way military strategists think about power. Moments when an assumption that seemed permanent suddenly collapses. For decades, one belief dominated military thinking in Eastern Europe. No country could seriously challenge Russia in its own sphere of influence. Russia's massive military, its enormous defense industry, its nuclear arsenal, and its sheer geographic depth made that idea seem unquestionable. Vladimir Putin said it himself. He insisted it was impossible. And yet today, something extraordinary has happened. Something even the Kremlin could not have imagined on that February morning when its tanks began rolling toward Kyiv. Not only has Ukraine survived against one of the largest militaries on Earth, it has begun transforming the battlefield in ways that are forcing every serious military power on the planet to rethink the future of warfare from the ground up. And perhaps most remarkable of all, this transformation is happening right under the nose of the very power that tried to crush it. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion, the expectation in many capitals was grim. Russian forces were supposed to overwhelm Ukrainian defenses in a matter of weeks. Some intelligence estimates predicted that Kyiv could fall within days. After all, the imbalance seemed overwhelming. Russia possessed one of the largest standing armies on the planet, thousands of tanks, hundreds of combat aircraft, long-range missile forces, and one of the most formidable artillery arsenals in the world. Ukraine, by comparison, was widely seen as the underdog. A determined country, certainly, but one that appeared to lack the industrial depth and technological resources of its far larger neighbor. But war rarely unfolds according to expectations. Instead of collapsing, Ukraine adapted, it innovated, and over time it began to change the rules of the conflict itself in ways that have stunned military analysts, reshaped European security, and forced militaries around the entire world to rethink the future of warfare. One of the most important turning points came in a domain where almost nobody expected Ukraine to excel: the sea. At the beginning of the war, Russia's naval dominance in the Black Sea appeared overwhelming. The Black Sea fleet was far larger and far more heavily armed than anything Ukraine could field. Much of Ukraine's traditional navy had already been lost during Russia's annexation of Crimea years earlier. On paper, the naval balance looked almost absurd. Yet what followed shocked military observers around the world. Instead of attempting to rebuild a conventional navy, which would have taken decades and billions of dollars, Ukraine pursued a completely different strategy. One that relied not on large warships, but on small, fast, and extremely lethal autonomous systems. Naval drones. These unmanned surface vessels, often costing only a tiny fraction of a traditional warship, began appearing in the Black Sea with devastating effect. Sleek, low profile, and difficult to detect on radar, they could travel long distances across open water before striking their targets with explosive payloads. Among the most famous of these systems is the Magura V5. At roughly 18 feet long, it might not look intimidating at first glance, but appearances can be deeply deceiving. Capable of traveling hundreds of miles, carrying a powerful explosive payload, and operating with minimal human intervention, the Magura V5 became one of the most disruptive naval weapons introduced in decades. And what made it even more remarkable was its cost. A modern naval warship can cost hundreds of millions, sometimes billions of dollars to build and maintain. The Magura V5 costs only a few $100,000. That cost imbalance changes everything, because suddenly the economics of naval warfare begin to shift dramatically. Instead of risking expensive ships against equally expensive adversaries, a smaller force can deploy dozens, even hundreds, of inexpensive drones capable of overwhelming even the most advanced defenses. The math becomes impossible for the defender to win. And that is exactly what Ukraine began doing. In May 2023, the world saw the first dramatic demonstration when naval drones attacked a Russian intelligence vessel in the Black Sea. The ship survived, but the message was unmistakable. The battlefield had changed. From that moment forward, Russian ships operating in the region could no longer assume safety. Soon after, the attacks intensified. Multiple strikes targeted Russian patrol ships, landing vessels, and major naval assets. In some cases, the drones were used in coordinated swarms, approaching from multiple directions simultaneously, forcing Russian defensive systems to respond under extreme pressure. Several vessels were severely damaged. Others were destroyed outright. And gradually, the balance of naval power in the Black Sea began shifting in ways that would have seemed unimaginable only a few years earlier. Ports that had once seemed secure were no longer safe. Supply routes became vulnerable. Eventually, the pressure became so intense that many Russian naval assets were relocated away from Crimea toward safer ports farther east. For Ukraine, this was an extraordinary achievement. A country that had lost much of its traditional navy had managed to push back a far larger maritime force using nothing but innovation, technology, and asymmetric strategy. But the most stunning naval achievement was still to come. On January 30th, 2026, Ukrainian naval drones achieved something no military force in history had ever accomplished. They shot down 2 Russian Su-30 fighter jets from the surface of the sea. The Magura V-7, a 24-foot unmanned surface vessel developed by Ukraine's intelligence directorate, was operating in the northwestern Black Sea when Russian aircraft attempted to intercept it. What the pilots did not know was that the V-7 carried AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles on launch rails, missiles that Ukraine had ingeniously integrated into its drone platform. As the Su-30s approached, the V-7's AI-enabled targeting system acquired both aircraft, calculated intercept trajectories, and launched. Both jets were destroyed. Naval drone history was rewritten in a single engagement. This shattered multiple assumptions that Russian military doctrine had held sacred, that naval drones were purely offensive weapons for attacking ships, that air superiority guaranteed freedom of operations over the Black Sea, that Ukraine lacked the technological sophistication to integrate Western missiles with domestically produced platforms. All 3 assumptions died in flames over the water that day, and yet the naval battlefield was only the beginning. While the world focused on the dramatic drone strikes at sea, Ukraine was quietly developing similar capabilities in the air and on land, and preparing something far more daring, something that would strike not just near the front lines, but deep inside Russia itself. For decades, one of the central pillars of Russian military confidence was the belief that its vast geography provided strategic security. Russia is enormous. Its military bases, bomber airfields, and logistics hubs stretch thousands of miles from its borders. That depth was supposed to make it extremely difficult for any adversary to conduct meaningful attacks on Russian strategic assets. The assumption was simple. Ukraine could fight defensively, but it could never seriously threaten installations far from the battlefield. Modern warfare has a way of dismantling old assumptions. One of the most audacious operations in the entire war unfolded on January 8, 2026, when Ukrainian forces simultaneously attacked 5 Russian airfields across Siberia and European Russia, including Engels II, home to Russia's most valuable strategic bombers. The method was pure Ukrainian ingenuity. Drone components were smuggled into Russia over months, hidden inside commercial shipments. They were assembled in secret locations near each target. The finished drones were loaded into specially modified trucks with detachable roofs, trucks driven across Russian roads before their roofs were remotely opened at a predetermined moment, and the drones launched from within Russia itself. 7 strategic bombers were damaged or destroyed. A Russian A-50U long-range radar detection aircraft, worth approximately $350 million, was severely damaged. Operation Spiderweb, as it became known, demonstrated that no location in Russia is safe from Ukrainian reach. The Kremlin's response was revealing. They blamed Ukrainian agents while refusing to acknowledge that the attack had originated from inside Russian territory, because to do so would be to admit that their internal security had been comprehensively penetrated. The psychological impact of operations like this cannot be overstated. Military power depends not only on weapons and soldiers, but on perception. If soldiers believe their bases are safe, they can focus on their missions. But if those bases suddenly become vulnerable to surprise attacks, the entire strategic calculation changes. Every airfield must now worry about hidden drones. Every supply depot must consider the possibility of sabotage. Every command center must prepare for threats that can appear without warning. This is exactly the disruption Ukraine has been engineering. By using asymmetric warfare, strategies that exploit weaknesses rather than confronting strength directly, Ukraine has forced Russia to devote increasing resources to defending territory that was once considered permanently secure. And that stretching of Russian defenses across an ever-widening battlefield has enormous strategic consequences. Every air defense battery protecting a distant logistics hub is one less battery protecting the front lines. The tools making all of this possible are not aircraft carriers or fleets of advanced fighter jets. They are small drones, thousands of them. In 2024, Ukraine produced approximately 100,000 first-person view drones per month. By early 2026, that figure had multiplied exponentially. Ukrainian Defense Minister Rustem Umerov announced that Ukraine had already contracted 3.5 million drones for 2026 alone, while Russian forces could field approximately 1.5 to 2 million. But quantity tells only part of the story. The quality gap, the innovation gap, has become a chasm that Russian industry cannot bridge. Consider the arithmetic of modern warfare. In a single engagement near Hulyapol in Zaporizhzhia Oblast, a Ukrainian drone unit destroyed a Russian T-90M Pro-Riv tank, one of Moscow's most advanced armored platforms, valued at approximately $4.5 million, using a modified commercial quadcopter carrying a shaped charge that cost less than $500. The asymmetry is not just dramatic, it is revolutionary. It is rewriting the economics of conflict entirely. And Ukraine has pushed that innovation even further. In December 2025, Ukraine's Ministry of Defense approved for operational use the Perun fiber optic FPV drone, a weapon system that communicates through a spool of fiber optic cable rather than radio waves. Russian electronic warfare systems, which had proven highly effective at jamming conventional drone signals, are completely useless against it. The drone flies to its target trailing a thread of fiber behind it, entirely immune to the most sophisticated Russian jamming technology in existence. It is a perfect example of how Ukrainian engineers are not just building weapons, they are redesigning the rules of engagement themselves. When Russia adapts to one innovation, Ukraine is already 3 steps ahead, testing the next one. This iterative cycle of development and deployment, driven by engineers working in close collaboration with frontline soldiers, has created a feedback loop that traditional military procurement systems simply cannot compete with. What might take a conventional defense contractor 3 to 5 years to develop in field, Ukraine is producing in months. On the night of February 24 to 25, 2026, and the 4th anniversary of the invasion, Ukraine launched its largest drone attack of the entire war against targets deep inside Russia. The strikes hit oil refineries, military airfields, and ammunition depots across 8 Russian regions. The Engels 2 airbase was struck for the 4th time in 6 months. The Ryazan oil refinery was set ablaze. These were not pinprick raids. These were strategic operations designed to systematically degrade Russia's capacity to wage war. And they are succeeding. Russian oil refining capacity has been reduced by approximately 15% since Ukraine began its deep strike campaign in earnest. But the transformation happening on the battlefield is only part of this story, because while drone strikes captured global headlines, something equally remarkable was unfolding on the ground. Ukrainian forces launched a series of counterattacks beginning in mid-December 2025 that stabilized control over Kupiansk and retook at least 183 square kilometers between December 11th and 25, pushing Russian forces out of several nearby settlements. In early February 2026, Ukrainian forces liberated multiple settlements in the Oleksandrivka and Hulyapol directions, gaining roughly 200 square kilometers while losing only 35 in other sectors during the same period. A net gain of 165 square kilometers in February alone. The last time Ukrainian forces achieved a net territorial gain was during the counteroffensive of 2023. For nearly 3 years, the dominant narrative had been one of Russian grinding advances, of Ukrainian defensive ingenuity, but ultimate positional loss. That narrative collapsed. Ukrainian Armed Forces Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky confirmed it directly. In February 2026, for the first time since the Kursk operation, Ukrainian defense forces regained control over more territory than the enemy managed to capture. President Zelensky stated flatly, "Putin lost his winter offensive." Since the beginning of 2026, Ukraine had recaptured 460 square kilometers of territory. The Institute for the Study of War's assessment captured the strategic reality with precision. The 5th year of Russia's invasion is not beginning well for Moscow. Recent Ukrainian successes on the battlefield disprove Russian claims that things can only get worse for Ukraine. Continued significant Russian battlefield gains, let alone total victory, are not inevitable. Not inevitable, those 2 words represent a catastrophic failure of Russian military strategy. The entire Kremlin narrative has rested on the proposition that time is on Russia's side, that Ukraine's Western support would fray, that Ukrainian society would fracture, that the sheer weight of Russian manpower would eventually crush all resistance. That proposition has now been tested in the crucible of winter 2026, and it has failed. The cost Russia is paying for what limited progress it does make tells its own brutal story. During the 3rd week of February 2026, Russian forces captured 22 square kilometers, at the average cost of approximately 295 soldiers per square kilometer, roughly 2.5 companies for every single kilometer of ground. The arithmetic of attrition is staggering. Beyond the battlefield, Ukraine's achievements are reshaping the broader balance of power in ways that would have seemed impossible when the war began. Ukraine's economy, despite 4 years of destruction and displacement, is not collapsing. It is adapting, innovating, and in critical sectors, growing. GDP grew by 4.2% in 2025, following 5.3% growth the year before. Inflation, which spiked to 26% in the war's first year, has fallen to 8%. The hryvnia has stabilized. Ukraine's IT sector expanded by 18% in 2025, with exports reaching $8.5 billion. Defense production increased by 600% between 2022 and 2025. Approximately 1.2 million Ukrainian refugees have returned permanently since 2023, bringing skills, capital, and children born in exile back to a country they refuse to abandon. These are not the statistics of a collapsing state. These are the metrics of a nation that has learned to fight and build simultaneously, and has gotten extraordinarily good at both. And then came something that may be the most striking symbol of this entire transformation. In December 2025, Ukraine exported its first major weapon system, the Magura V-7 naval drone, to the United States under a licensing agreement. A nation fighting for its survival became a weapons exporter. A country under daily bombardment developed technology that the world's most advanced military wanted to buy. The diplomatic picture has shifted just as dramatically. Ukrainian officials no longer arrive in Western capitals as supplicants begging for aid. They arrive as strategic partners shaping the future of European security. On March 2, 2026, the United Kingdom and France jointly announced a new security framework that effectively integrates Ukraine into European defense planning at a level previously reserved for NATO members. And on March 4, 2026, the European Union formally opened accession negotiations with Ukraine, setting a target date of 2029 for full membership, the precise outcome Putin launched his invasion to prevent. Perhaps most remarkable of all is what the war has done to Ukrainian society itself. Polling in February 2026 found that 87% of Ukrainians believe their country will exist as an independent state in 50 years, up from 62% in 2021. Asked whether they identify primarily as Ukrainian, 91% said yes, the highest figure ever recorded. Putin's war has achieved the exact opposite of its stated purpose. It has not demilitarized Ukraine. It has created the most battle-hardened, technologically sophisticated military in Europe. It has not broken Ukrainian identity. It has forged a civic national consciousness stronger than any in Ukrainian history. It has not pulled Ukraine back into Russia's orbit. It has integrated Ukraine more deeply into European and transatlantic structures than any peacetime diplomacy could ever have achieved. Ukraine's army has grown to an estimated 800,000 troops, arguably the largest in Europe, and many of them are seasoned, combat-tested, and highly adaptable. The battlefield experience those soldiers carry is a long-term strategic asset that will define Ukraine's military power for decades. Countries can purchase weapon systems, but the lessons learned under continuous fire cannot be replicated artificially. Ukraine is accumulating human capital that no defense budget can simply write a check for. Military planners around the world are taking note, not just because Ukraine has survived, but because of what it has demonstrated about the future of warfare itself. Countries in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East are studying Ukraine's battlefield tactics in detail, trying to understand how a nation under enormous pressure managed to turn technological ingenuity into strategic advantage. A future where autonomous systems, artificial intelligence, and distributed networks of small weapons platforms can challenge even the most powerful conventional forces on Earth. A future where the decisive advantage belongs not to the largest army, but to the fastest innovator. A future where the cost asymmetry between offense and defense has been permanently reversed, where a $500 drone can destroy a $4.5 million tank, and where a $300,000 naval drone can sink a warship that cost 100 times more to build. Ukraine has become a global laboratory for that future, testing, iterating, and deploying new systems at a speed that traditional military bureaucracies cannot match. Drone designs are updated on weekly cycles, incorporating real battlefield feedback into new variants that Russian forces have never encountered. The Magura series has already progressed from V5 to V7, with each version incorporating lessons from previous operations. The V8 is already in development, and the innovations are not staying within Ukraine's borders. Through licensing agreements, co-production deals, and technology transfers, Ukraine is exporting the future of warfare to allies who recognize that what has been proven under fire in the Black Sea and on the plains of Zaporizhzhia represents the cutting edge of 21st century military capability. 4 years ago, Russian tanks rolled toward Kyiv. The world held its breath. Pundits debated whether Ukraine would survive days or weeks. The Kremlin planned victory parades. Today, Ukrainian flags fly over recaptured villages in Zaporizhzhia. Ukrainian drones hunt Russian aircraft over the Black Sea. Ukrainian soldiers, the most experienced infantry on the continent, hold the line against an enemy that has nothing left to throw at them but bodies. And Ukrainian diplomats sit at the table where the future of European security is being decided. Putin said Ukraine's independence was worth zero. He said Russia would win in days. He said time was on Moscow's side. He insisted certain outcomes were simply impossible. He was wrong about all of it. The war is not over. The sacrifices are not complete. The suffering continues, and it is real, enormous, and carried by an entire generation of Ukrainians who have known nothing but war for 4 years. But the trajectory is undeniable and clear. The impossible has become inevitable. And Vladimir Putin, who launched this war believing he understood the laws of history, has learned the lesson that every would-be conqueror eventually learns: history does not follow orders. Because in the age of drones, algorithms, and distributed strike systems, power no longer belongs exclusively to the largest armies. Sometimes it belongs to the fastest innovators. And Ukraine has proven, beyond any doubt, that the fastest innovator in this war has not been Russia. The battlefield is evolving. Ukraine is leading the way, and those who underestimate it now do so at their own peril. The impossible is no longer impossible.